This briefing, Regulatory Harmonization, a critical new front in the battle for sensible safeguards, focuses on a new US-EU trade negotiation. This negotiation is the most imminent threat in a continuing effort to undermine our gains in public protections by calling them trade barriers. The proposed Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, or TAFTA, will focus on regulatory issues and these so-called trade barriers, and will go after a target list provided by industry that includes the best of EU and US consumer, economic, and environmental laws and regulations. It will set a ceiling on each country's standards and subject countries to trade sanctions if they do not weaken their existing and future procedures in setting up regulations that protect consumers, public health, and the environment. Absent serious intervention to stop TAFTA, regulatory harmonization could become an extremely effective Trojan Horse device that is sold in the name of free trade, but in fact will deliver regulatory rollbacks of stunning proportions.
Trade agreement that will soon, or is beginning to be negotiated, goes through, what it could mean for all kinds of regulatory health and safety protections that we all care about. I think that the most important thing in general that we're concerned about is that it potentially will give corporations the right to sue. Currently, if they want to change laws or regulations, they have to, if they want to sue, they have to talk their national government into doing it on their behalf. But there's a possibility that they could do it on their own and start bringing lawsuits and questioning and challenging regulations and laws on their own, which of course we don't want them to do. We've already seen corporations becoming increasingly ambitious in this arena. ExxonMobil, Dow Chemical have challenged Canadian rules that apply to offshore drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and the use of pesticides. So they're beginning to develop some precedents, or at least there's a precedent for them doing the challenges, which is very concerning to all of us. Lori Wallach, who will be, we hope, our first speaker, is an amazing, steeped in this issue of trade negotiations and has been for years and years. She is, without question, as the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch since 1995, she has got to be the most informed and deepest expert on this of anyone in Washington and around the country. I have to say, when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation when I first met Lori, and it was in 1999, I think, the multilateral agreement on investments that actually got stopped. So because of the citizen mobilization that was going on around the country, when folks at the state and local level, public officials actually realized what they were potentially sacrificing, ability to do set-asides and other kinds of things, tools that they had used in the policy arena, they got on board and stopped that agreement from going through. And Lori was central to that and doing the education around it. But I just wanted to raise that because it's one of our, it was a success story, and so we hope this will be another one in terms of stopping the worst things in this. The other two speakers that we have today are Ed Merzinski, who is the U.S. Consumer Program Director and co-chair of the U.S. side of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue. And he will explain to you what that's about and what they've been doing around these issues. And then Tony Corbo, who is a senior lobbyist for the food campaign for Food and Water Watch, and responsible for all kinds of food-related health and safety regulatory issues that come before Congress and the executive branch. We've been privileged to work with Tony on the poultry campaign, stop the poultry rule.
Well, as Catherine said, I'm Ed Merzinski. I'm with USPIRG. I've been with USPIRG as Consumer Program Director for about 23 years. And in 1998, USPIRG and other consumer groups, including Public Citizen, Consumers Union, Consumer Federation of America on the U.S. side, and including the leading counterpart groups, BEUC, which is kind of the Consumer Federation of Europe, and the counterpart organizations that publish consumer protection magazines in other European countries, were asked by the European government to form an advisory committee, the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, partly to compete with a very powerful lobbying force that the Chamber and others had set up called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. Now, at that time, the EU also suggested that that labor and environmentalists set up similar organizations, and legislators as well. I've lost track of those organizations, but the consumer dialogue has been running ever since, and we have a quasi-advisory capacity. We're not one of those advisory committees that you have to have a security clearance for, that you get access to the treaty documents, but we do have the ability to request and get pretty good government participation at a general level. So there are a lot of single-issue consumer groups that are members on both sides, but all the leading consumer groups and organizations that might be considered privacy or other groups are members. And we also get some grant funding, but we don't get any money from the U.S. government. Under Clinton, we got some chump change, but since then we really haven't been supported, but the Europeans still support us. And we obviously advocate stronger protections in health, food, safety, financial, intellectual property, and other consumer matters in treaties. By the way, so what I'm doing is just kind of a little bit of a background on some of what's at stake in these battles. And I think a lot of it won't be new to very many of you. It's really setting the stage for Lori to come in a few minutes and tell us, now, how exactly are they going to do that? So why don't we move to the next slide, please? Our position internationally is the same as all of our positions here at the U.S. level, and that is that consumers and markets are best served when federal law or international law serves as a floor of protection, and local states, or in the European context, member states, are allowed to enact stronger standards to protect health and safety. But unless we fight back, whether they call it preemption, as is what it's called here in Washington, or whether it's called harmonization or regulatory convergence, which is what it's generally called in the international front, we're all going to end up with a decrease in consumer and worker welfare unless we can stop them. So again, nothing new here. It's just that they're moving this fight to they've moved this fight to the international arena. Next slide, please. I think you might have skipped one. So this slide, if we can get back to it, this slide basically says that in all the years that I've worked here, and I think others would generally agree, Congress usually only protects consumers, the environment, or taxpayers after a major crisis. There's got to be some sort of just epic fail for Congress to act. So the Dodd-Frank Act, including the creation of the CFPB, that's Rich Cordray down there in the corner, in response to Wall Street reforms that a number of our groups worked on as part of another coalition called Americans for Financial Reform. We had to completely fail the economy, worst case since 1929, in order to get those responses from Congress. Corporate reform, those of you that worked on the Enron reforms, after that spectacular bankruptcy of Enron, resulted in the tremendous loss of pension wealth for thousands and thousands of Americans, job layoffs, catastrophe in our electrical markets, and a lot of other problems. We did not get Sarbanes-Oxley corporate reform because of Enron's historic collapse. They were ready to beat us and pass an industry accountant-favored bill until WorldCom collapsed. If people don't remember, first it was Enron, and then a year later, WorldCom. Bush had to go up to Wall Street, ring the bell or whatever it is, and do a speech saying, "I will sign the bill, I will sign the bill." So it was an epic collapse of corporate protections. This is the only reason Congress acted. The product safety bill that many of our organizations worked on in 2009, I got this little third recall. In August of 2007, when Congress was out, the New York Times and then other papers started running stories about boats full of lead-laden toys and other dangerous products coming from China, and that gave us the leverage to pass reform. We had to be killing children before Congress would do anything about it. And finally, food safety modernization. I mean, Upton Sinclair wrote the book in 1906. Congress finally acted in 2011 after about 10 years of epidemics here in the United States. All kinds of food crises that others in the room, I think, know a lot more than I do about. But My point is Congress very rarely acts without a crisis unless, next slide please, unless the states or the cities lead first. And so I just put up some examples here that a number of our organizations have worked on. The Community Right to Know Act, the Toxic Use Reduction Act. They started with worker committees, and then cities, and then states, and then finally Congress acted. Free credit reports and other identity theft reforms. They were passed in many, many states before Congress passed minimalist versions of some of those protections. And then I just have a big list: outdoor air pollution laws, smoke-free indoor air laws, the do not call list that the FTC takes credit for was passed in 46 states before the FTC. Predatory lending reforms were proposed or enacted in numerous states leading up to the crisis, but the OCC and the OTS, the late OTS, I'm happy to say, but the OCC also is under new management, are the two bank regulators that routinely preempted states from enforcing their laws and protecting their public. Organic food labeling, et cetera, et cetera. There are just numerous examples where when the states lead, Congress follows. And the next step, again, next slide please, is that the Chamber and NAM are well aware of this. They don't have the power in the states that they do in Washington, but they have gotten behind this notion of a free trade agreement with Europe, whether it's called TAFTA or the Trade and Investment Partnership or whatever it'll be called next week. But they see international treaties as an even better way to limit public protection than federal preemption is. International harmonization is a way to eliminate sensible safeguards and public protections once and for all, and that is why they are working so hard on this. By the way, when I'm done, if Lori's not here yet, maybe Rob can make a few comments. Rob Weissman from Public Citizen is actually speaking at an international meeting of the governments in the next couple of days, and guess where that international meeting is being held? Is anyone else speaking at it? It's being held at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Anyway, that's just an aside. Let's move on to the next slide. And so I think that the work that Global Trade Watch does and the work that TAFTA does is really to continue to work with our European allies and continue to insist that trade policies preserve stronger local laws. Next slide, please. And just a couple of examples that I've put together. President Obama actually proposed a pretty good privacy bill of rights about a year ago, a year and 3 months ago. But it's primarily advisory. It's primarily by industry self-regulation. Really, the best chance we have to get better privacy protections for U.S. citizens is to continue to allow the European community to continue to take the lead, and finally we'll end up with something that's pretty good. But you can see Google, gave a little bit of money to the Federal Trade Commission. Facebook gave a little bit of money to the Federal Trade Commission. They said they wouldn't do anything again that was bad for privacy, but then every couple of months they do it again. But the Europeans are really beating on them, and there's a really good chance to hold them accountable by passing strong laws in European countries and not having some trade harmonization rule that prevents the strong European laws or incipient U.S. laws from moving higher. Next slide, please. Another example, chemical hazards. A lot of organizations work on worker health and safety, and it's also chemical hazards deals with family and community health and safety as well. The U.S. law has been broken for years and years. It's based on a very bad model, the Toxic Substances Control Act. Again, there are people in this room that could tell you much more about it than I can, but I can tell you that I'm pretty sure that we've only fully regulated something like 7 or 8 chemicals. Do the EDF people know, or somebody else? Some very tiny number of chemicals. But the European rule, REACH, for all its flaws, the industry has been fighting it for years, but it is the better way to go, and it is based on something that all the U.S. consumer and environmental groups believe in, which is the precautionary principle. And now everyone who's working on cost-benefit analysis in this room knows that industry is trying to base everything on science, and they're trying to cripple and paralyze our regulatory system through science. Well, they're trying to do the same thing through international rules. They don't like REACH. They don't like strong precautionary principle-based protections, and that's why they're behind this trade rule. Next slide, please. This is a slide based on some work by the Center for Food Safety, which is a member of TAFTA, and I'm guessing also a member of CSS. And at the top, it shows that even though the California genetic food labeling law lost on the ballot in November, that polling done right afterwards by Lake research partners showed that actually the public strongly supports strong genetically modified food labeling. There are environmental reasons to support it. There are consumer choice reasons. Of course, the industry has been pushing back for years. The bottom there is a screen grab from part of a slide of CFS, and on the right, where everything is green, that's Europe. And the one blue one is actually a ban on GMO imports. And green is required labeling on GMO imports. And the big beige, or whatever that color is, blank with no protections, that's the United States and Canada. So the best way for us to go forward is to continue to protect stronger European laws and then try to pass them here in the United States rather than have them be preempted or harmonized downward. And then I think the last slide just basically is an excerpt from a letter that TAFTA sent recently to the two chief trade negotiators, then Ambassador Kirk and Commissioner de Gucht, which is over on the table over there. And basically the TAFTA position is any rule should require high standards of consumer and other protections while affording both trading partners the autonomy to adopt stronger facially non-discriminatory protections. And I'll let Lori go into the details on that, but that simply means that you can't have a protection that only applies to outside firms. It's got to apply equally to domestic or international companies. And so, I mean, like I say, I don't think I'm telling you anything new here, except that the fight is escalating because these trade negotiations are really an opportunity where the Chamber and NAM, unless we get more involved, really have a lot of a phalanx of lobbyists. That's all I've got.
Anybody have any questions for Ed about how what's going on in the EU? I do. I'll just, what's your sense of how mobilized consumer groups that you've been working with over the last decade, how mobilized they are now given all the difficult financial circumstances that European countries are facing, and potential budget cuts and austerity programs that they're having to endure? What does that, do you have a sense of what that's done to their regulatory regimes?
I think that's, I don't know the answer to how well the European governments are enforcing regulatory laws. What's the impact on the consumer groups? I think the consumer groups are more invigorated over this focused fight than they have been in a very long time, and this gives them something to aim at. And we're seeing a lot of opportunities to organize with them. And some of the issues here, which I'm sure Lori will get into some of the details on, are that, again, this event at the Chamber of Commerce, a government event at the Chamber of Commerce, somehow every industry association, including dozens that you've never heard of, are on the panel and knew about this, and we found out about it at the last minute. And there's no transparency, there's no openness to consumer groups, and we really need to keep this riding herd on the governments to make sure we know what's going on. But I think the European groups are just as angry as we are that the governments have set this thing up to just drive forward and let the consumer groups be an afterthought. We're saying no to that. So I think they're very organized.
And are you the only person who's speaking at the Chamber of Commerce today?
There's a couple, but Rob.
We are. In addition to Rob. But anybody other than public citizen? Senator Brucey. And that's it? Against tons of industry groups?
Yeah, the way it's set up is in contrast to what Ed said, they were very fair actually what they did. The first half hour of the day and a half long session of the Chamber of Commerce is devoted to the business point of view, including the parallel group to TAFTA, which used to be called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, but is now called the Business Council. They get actually, I think, 35 minutes. Then the consumer and public welfare groups, they call it, get 30 minutes. That's us. So 35, 30. That seems kind of fair. And the rest of the day and a half is all business groups with two exceptions. sector by sector. And it's, people are in another second. So I mean, in terms of what's going to come up, I think, and Lord will sort of go through the processes, but part of what we hope comes out of this meeting is that everybody's sort of motivated to review this process from the point of view of the things that you're expert in, because it will intrude into everything. And as Lori's about to tell you, the point of this agreement is zero to do with tariffs, and they're explicit about it in terms of this agreement as opposed to others, is entirely about regulatory matters. This hearing that's going to be held on Wednesday is part of like this 15-year process that's been going on leading up to this now launch of this trade negotiation. The U.S. Trade Representative had a notice and comment period that ended in October. There's another one that just came out, by the way, that people should file comments for. Basically saying, what do you want in terms of harmonization, regulatory convergence, they have these different names. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff, but it's really very intrusive. For example, the Renderers Association, you guys know what rendering is? Okay, the Renderers Association are very upset about the unfair restrictions the Europeans have on importation of rendered U.S. product. So it's like going to hit everything. There's no limit in terms of what they're going to go from food to privacy, and that's just sort of on this, these kind of traditional consumer environmental things. There's tons of other things like antitrust, intellectual property, and a whole bunch of other things that they're going to go after.
I'm going to do an overview of what sort of generally is the framework we're dealing with as far as some of the mechanisms of potential regulatory rollback, of which my colleagues can provide concrete examples, but also some things specifically about this transatlantic agreement. And what am I not doing right here?
Left click.
Whoops, there we go. Okay, so they're calling it the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP. We should never say that. I think a more accurate thing would be TAFTA, not just because it rhymes with NAFTA, that would be Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, but also because this negotiation, this process has a long antecedent, in that this has been something that's been talked about, having a transatlantic free trade agreement as the goal coming out of what is what's called the high-level US-EU dialogue, of which part of it is the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, which folks know about. Rob's going to be testifying on behalf of TACD, and also the TABD, the business side of it. The high-level dialogue sent out a final report in February this year, announcing that they decided to launch talks. There's been sort of a contentious issue, gone back and forth, and by the way, we have copies of these slides, and these slides have a lot more information that I'm going to cover and a bunch of website links with the notion, because this is really, if you have not delved into this land, it's as alien as, say, tax law would be for me. So just so everyone has is to walk away with and can go to some of these original documents. That document is kind of innocuous, but one of my slides is keywords. It's a translation key of what certain innocuous sounding words really mean in the context of that document, which is sort of worth thinking about. The official notice of intent to launch negotiations was sent to Congress on March 20th, so formal negotiations can start 90 days from now, that's June 18th. There have been talks from the press about starting in May. Probably that would be the high-level dialogue folks trying to figure out what's called the terms of reference. That's sort of the structure of what they'll negotiate. That's worth us trying to weigh in on. And they've said it'll be 2 years to do. As Rob said, the focus of the negotiations, the tariffs between the countries, the border tax is already low. So this explicit focus is regulatory issues and non-tariff trade barriers, and that's from actually the announcement. So what does that mean? I would say as a preview for anyone who's paid any attention to the Transatlantic Partnership, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, TPP, 29 chapters of that agreement. Only 5 of them have to do with anything related to traditional trade, tariffs, quotas, dumping, the real trade stuff. All the other stuff is behind the border regulatory issues. Again, context to this, because I'm going to explain how all this works, but the bigger context is this is the idea of a free trade agreement between the EU and the US is a long-time project of what was the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, TABD. It's been renamed the TBC, the Transatlantic Business Council. It's some keywords we're going to review that they talk a lot about are eliminating trade irritants and regulatory convergence. Trade irritants, bad. Regulatory convergence, good. Some of my favorite TABC, well, they're now merged and I can't say the acronym. Some of those business guys to keep an eye on include the folks there, but I have their website up there so you can actually go see the whole gang. Now, some key words for translation. Trade irritant, they also are sometimes called non-tariff barriers. That is any domestic regulatory policy measure or action that limits EU or US business access to the other market. So some things we know are going to get discussed that are examples of what this, from their perspective, is. Note, we call these our environmental, health, safety, and consumer product standards, financial regulations, etc. But from their language, just in translation, in our dictionary of TABD land, trade irritant would include things like elements of the US financial re-regulation that in some way affect their businesses. So they're griping about the Volcker rule, for instance. Very soon they're going to start griping about the new rules about what kind of corporate structure foreign banks have to be organized through, this rule that started working its way through the Fed. They have griped for a decade plus about our system of state insurance regulation. So, you know, where from consumers group's perspective, yay, California leads the whole nation towards a better thing. From their perspective, the very notion of federalism in insurance regulation is a trade irritant, and in fact, from their perspective, is an illegal trade barrier. We've had some fights about that, but they haven't had the legal rules to get us. The goal would be to set those rules. Now, those are the things in the US that the European corporations, in cahoots with their US counterparts, want to go after using this policy, this negotiation. There are a lot of other things in the EU where they're doing better than we are in certain regulations. So a whole raft of food safety rules, GMO labeling and segregation, a whole variety of things about meat dips and sort of sterilization of meat that's on the front end too disgusting and has to be dumped in chlorine effectively. There are different additives like ractopamine, which a lot of countries ban, the EU bans, so as a result they ban some of our exports. There are a whole set of issues relating to REACH, the much stronger chemical policy, this for which we should aspire, given we have a very outdated system that needs updating. There are chunks of the EU climate directive. Everyone's heard about the whole airlines tax piece, but they ain't the half of it. There are a whole bunch of them on the list. And then, you know, another one that's always been a hot issue is consumer data privacy and the whole EU safe harbor system, which again, we should only aspire. Now, another word you hear is legacy issues. Legacy issues are the same list of items above that have not been settled to the business interests outcome. So a legacy issue is an outstanding fight about one of these gripes that they haven't gotten settled. You will have heard, for instance, Mike Froman, who's the top-level administration official in his news release. If you look at the transcript, we will be focusing on legacy issues. That's what he's talking about. They see them as market opening. Behind the border, these are obviously all synonyms, are all of the domestic regulations you think have nothing to do with the trade negotiation that actually are what is the target. So it's non-tariff measures that really we would think of as in the jurisdiction of domestic, federal, or state, or for that matter, local policymakers. And regulatory convergence actually is a different theory. It's similar, but in addition to the actual standards being the same, it also goes to having the standards making process be the same. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement has a whole regulatory convergence chapter, and the whole thing is about mandating every other country to set up an OIRA.
Oh
so that,
my God.
I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. I could not make this up.
Oh, you could not.
So basically that one, all the different specific chapters are, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this with these kind of standards. And then that one is, and by the way, in addition to all that, here's how you have to go about the process. There must be cost-benefit analysis. You must establish a national agency that can do reviews, etc. So now, having dropped all those bombs, I think a lot of people are probably saying, you know, all right, but how does this work? How can this possibly work? So I just want to step back for 1 minute, and for folks who are not already somewhat inured to this world, and give a little snapshot. So everyone thinks of trade agreements as what came out of Bretton Woods, the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It only covered trade in goods. If you could not drop it on your foot, it was not covered by the GATT. So physical things crossing borders. And that was the rule for 50 years. And the IMF and the World Bank we're not going to get into, but those are the three Bretton Woods institutions. All right. Late mid-1980s, Reagan starts negotiating, basically with the help of Thatcher and his ideological allies in Germany, about how stuck they all are with a variety of not traditional trade issues, and they find this obscure thing called the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations being negotiated that would be an interesting vehicle. So they push for replacing the old GATT, a contract about trade terms, with a thing called the World Trade Organization, which has binding dispute settlements. GATT, they put under it as one of 17 agreements it's going to enforce. The other agreements are things that largely have nothing to do with trade. So General Agreement on Trade and Services is not just trade and services. It's regulation of services in your country. So a financial firm, foreign financial firm, German, Deutsche Bank, in the US, it sets limits on how you can regulate them when they're in your country. It sets immigration standards and visas. I mean, this is just because this is a hot issue right now, not in our topic, but the US bound having a certain number of H-1B visas in the WTO. We could have 80% unemployment and we still have an obligation in movement of natural persons to deliver services. It covers everything. SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary, food standards, labeling, inspection, technical barriers to trade, all non-food product standards, as well as some food ones like GMOs because they're not considered to have a health effect. Trade-related intellectual property, TRIPS, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, rolling in graves because those would happen to be monopolies. Yes, monopoly patents, copyrights, etc. Put in a free trade agreement. The other three agreements relevant but not as directly to us. Then add to the WTO and all of its pieces NAFTA, CAFTA, and the free trade agreements. Those agreements have the same stuff that are in the WTO system, but they actually go further. They go further in some distinct ways I'm going to describe, but those are ways that make what this potential negotiation is about incredibly important. Right now, our economic relations, our law between the US and the EU economically is under the WTO. The WTO is the state of the art in the late 80s and 90s when it was created of what corporate international governance should look like. It's gotten a lot worse since then, I'm sad to say. So, in fact, there's a lot at risk to having, if you will, a US-European NAFTA as compared to the current rules we have, which are the WTO. Stepped back, a key sort of way of thinking about this, because again, it gets hard to get one's head wrapped around this for folks who are working in the domestic realm. The best way to think about these so-called trade agreements is not that they're just not mainly about trade anymore. And particularly this one, which they've said up front isn't going to be about trade. Rather, these agreements are a delivery mechanism that implements a wide set of other policies. And so I always bring a copy of the WTO and the NAFTA's non-tariff rules. This is not the trade part. These 900 pages are non-trade regulatory constraints, which we can just pass around so people can, because people are NAFTA, WTO, and it's like an abstract idea. No, it's a huge set of binding international law. And they implement these goals, which are frequently called the neoliberal policy package or Washington Consensus. Of special interest to this group's work are the rules in these agreements that cut, weaken, or harmonize standards, product standards, food standards, service sector regulatory standards relating to energy, financial services, the environment, you name it, and the different instruments they use, which I'm going to go through, but things like harmonization, mutual recognition, equivalence. There is deregulation of services quite explicitly. I'm going to talk a little bit about the details of that. The US made very broad commitments in the WTO relative to other countries, but we didn't commit most of our sectors. In WTO, you only are bound to the sectors you put in. With the FTAs, everything is in unless you take something out. So that's one of the huge differences between what the existing regulatory space is with respect to the expansive realm of services. Everything from transportation, education, financial services, retail, land use that goes to construction, etc. All of those issues, we right now actually have some policy space because where we bound ourselves with respect to the EU in WTO is, I mean, it was not great. Believe me, we took way too many commitments in the first place, but in addition, there's still space. And if you see that website up there, we have an online searchable site, thanks actually to Ford Foundation funding from years ago, where we have translated the entire US GATS, WTO services commitment schedule, into a search. You can just do, you know, construction, or you can do education, and that pops up what the commitments are, what the offers are. Extensive intellectual property rights. So very specific terms every country has to adopt relating to patents for a whole range of different subject matters, obviously medicines, but as well think about the implications for things like climate and energy-related technologies. As well, there is, in the case of medicines, attempts to extend through these FTAs additional monopolies on the data used to do the testing that you would need as a generic to get it actually approved for marketing, in addition once the 20-year patent runs out. There are also rules on copyright that have been, those are the chapters that people talk about this agreement being a potential backdoor SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, as far as limiting internet freedom and making consumers liable for non-commercial small-scale copying. Deregulation of investments and new foreign investor privileges. This is the infamous investor state dispute resolution system and investor privileges regime we're going to explore. The punchline of this, and I'm going to make sure everyone's put down hot coffee. The punchline of this is this agreement between the US and the EU would be privately enforceable, some of its provisions, by individual corporations or investors who would be authorized to sue our governments, not in our courts, but in extrajudicial tribunals, investment tribunals, set up by with judges of 3 private sector attorneys who rotate between acting as the judges and actually suing the governments. And they can demand compensation for almost any domestic regulatory action or policy that they think undermines their expected future profits. You will hear this many times with the cases spelled out. I have slides we're going to buzz over because the looks I am seeing of, you must be kidding, are so unbelievable. I actually have lots of slides for you to take home to make clear I am not making this stuff up, as horrific as it is. All right, other of these issues are relevant, financial liberalization being a big one. The biggest deal in financial liberalization, I think, is the total ban on the use of capital controls and so financial transaction taxes, and a very serious problem about a ban, even if it applies to domestic and foreign firms equally, is considered a zero quota and therefore is forbidden as a quantitative restriction. So you just decide you're going to ban something because it just has no actual merit. It's all risk, no social benefit. If it is not excluded as an exception to your agreement, that is a violation of your commitments in market access, which totally contradicts, of course, where a lot of countries are going. So punchline, it's not about trade, system of global governance. The problem is it's not easily modified, which is a very big point about why, let's say, we already have some rules we don't love between the US and the EU. Why is this different? And say there's some mutual recognition agreements that are terrific. The difference is this can only be changed, the entire thing, any comma, any phrase, by consensus of the parties. So unlike domestic legislation, where we lose one, there's some god-awful preemption that happens, and then horrible things happen, or there's a deregulation that proved to be lunatic, and then people see the results, we go back to Congress and we say, as we said, and then we fight the uphill battle and we get it fixed. These things are like super glue, or like hardened cement, in that even if something's happened domestically, you end up stuck in the past. So just for instance, the financial rules of the WTO, the limits on regulation, are rules from the late 1980s, 1990s, the heyday of deregulation. Here we've had the global financial crisis. The whole rest of the world's moving on. Domestic regulation, the IMF is even like reviewing its policies. WTO agreement stuck in the past. You can't change a comma unless everyone agrees. Now, the typical boilerplate of what is in these agreements is sort of the punchline of how it works. Because a lot of folks will say, okay, there are a lot of stupid rules, but how is it ever enforced? So this is the legal obligation that is in almost all of these agreements. This one happens to be the exact quote out of the WTO. Each member shall ensure the conformity of its laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with its obligations. And they'll say in the annexed agreements. And that's what you're passing around. Those are the annexed agreements. So each country has to ensure conformity of its procedures, its laws, its policies. And unless there's an exception, that goes top to bottom. So it presumes all the way down to local. So state law is covered. And the rules are enforced. Now, for anyone here who works in environmental issues and you just fantasize about, oh, couldn't a multilateral environmental treaty actually be enforced? This is enforceable. Built into these agreements are 2 mechanisms for enforcement. WTO only allows governments to enforce against each other. Any government can sue another government saying, your law does not conform with your obligations. You signed this agreement and you did not conform. And if a tribunal at the WTO of trade officials decides that's true, they tell you, your country, change that law, you're going to face indefinite trade sanctions until you do. Actual sanctions. It's enforceable international governance. In the FTAs, and we have confirmed for the US-EU agreement, there is also this private enforcement mechanism, where individual companies are raised to the same level as a sovereign nation state to privately enforce a public treaty. The way the right to enforce is set out, it's not something that environmental or labor or consumer groups could do. It is an investor as defined as someone who's made a money investment. It's a very one-sided private enforcement. And in those cases, the government has to compensate the private interest with government money. I have more slides on the details of that because I'm watching Catherine shake her head and it just seems so crazy. And when you first hear about it, it takes some effort to get your head around it. This is very different, this model of so-called trade agreements than past agreements. And this is a point I want to flag because having gone through with Public Citizen as well, 20 years of the folks who want the status quo pretending it's a free trade agreement and branding it that way. Because all smart people are for free trade. So if you're criticizing this agreement, you are an idiot, a protectionist, a closet supporter of Pat Buchanan, new isolationist. Clearly something is wrong. In fact, they've done a really good marketing job to effectively create a Trojan Horse painted trade agreement through which a whole other agenda is being wheeled forward. And to some degree, our biggest job, because Ginny said, so what the hell do we do about this? Part of our biggest job is actually just to debunk the myth and make clear, both to decision makers and to the public, what it is exactly that is being actually suggested to be pursued. Now, I put this list in just again so that folks think I'm being hyperbolic, but no, these are some of the cases that the WTO has actually ruled against domestic regulatory policies. We have a chart on our website. The WTO rules against the domestic law that's challenged 91% of the time. This is the kind of court where even I could be a successful lawyer, assuming I was on the bad guy side. The Thai cigarette regulations, the US cigarette regulation, the ban on sweet flavored cigarettes, India's constitution banning its monopoly patent of life forms and medicines and seeds, Europe's GMO regulatory policies, the artificial growth hormone ban in Europe. The US has lost a bunch of environmental cases, Clean Air Act regs on gasoline, cleanliness, Endangered Species Act stuff. We also have lost we had lost a challenge on country of origin meat labeling, the COOL program. Then there's the private investment system. This is what I was talking about, the investor state system. And I thought the best way to get folks' heads around it would just be to go through a current case. So just this fall, Eli Lilly, using this system, which is narrower than is now in TPP, and I suspect will be proposed for TAFTA, Eli Lilly used this private investment system in NAFTA to challenge $100 million in compensation from Canada over its patent system, where one of Eli Lilly's medicine patents had been declared by a Canadian court and then an appeals court to not meet the patentability standard. Their patentability standard is promise doctrine, and for actually the utility, it's promise doctrine, and you have to actually show that there's some evidence of the utility you claim. They had not done that. They had one study of 12 people, etc. So this is the first time that patent holding company has used a so-called trade agreement to go after trying to get an extension of their monopoly. It's not in Canadian court. It's not even under the intellectual property rules of NAFTA. It's an investor claim. Their investor right has been undermined. I use this example because it shows how broad is the potential attack under these investment rules. So these substantive rules that are in the investment chapters of these agreements go beyond what the domestic property right standard is. It's not just treat them the same. There's substantive extra protections, and then there are better procedural rights, because you can just form shop. You incorporate a subsidiary someplace, use the investor state mechanism to pursue a claim you wouldn't have on the merits in domestic law in a jurisdiction, a tribunal of 3 private sector trained attorneys who have a rather severe conflict of interest. Oh, and they get paid by the hour. So the longer it goes on, the longer they make money. So what they're saying, Eli Lilly's saying, or these are the investor rights that are violated. I'm going to touch on a few of these in a couple of slides, but there is compensation for indirect expropriation under these agreements. Regulatory takings compensation, not generally allowed here. Incredibly chilling. There's a guaranteed minimum standard of treatment, which has been interpreted to mean almost any regulatory change undermines an investor's expectation for a stable regulatory climate. This is a regulatory-free standard. And the thing is, again, I have a bunch of slides I'm going to buzz over that have this language with quotes, so that when all of you leave thinking, I must have misunderstood that woman, you can actually go to the arbitration award, pick it up, read the words of said tribunal, don't take it from me. They're also arguing, just as humor, that there is discrimination. The discrimination is between brand name drugs and generic drugs because they're not treated the same. That's not a claim that would stand up in a regular court.
Price difference is price discrimination?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a claim I actually even think the tribunal will throw out as bad as they are. So this is going to be heard by this investor state tribunal, 3 private sector attorneys. I put a study in there that's really horrifying, where they've gone through and found out, like for instance, there are 15 of these guys on the list, and it's almost all men, who are in 55% of the cases. So it's not just that, it's a club. It's a really small club. There are no conflict of interest rules, very bad. They can set any amount of damages. One of the most recent ones for Ecuador, where the corporation Occidental broke a contract, Ecuador has to pay the corporation that screwed the country $3 billion. And they're not bound by precedent. There are a whole set of Philip Morris cases. Philip Morris keeps reincorporating itself in different flavors to go sue different countries. They're suing, they're claiming that they're a Hong Kong company to investor states sue Australia about cigarette plain packaging. They said they're a Swiss firm to attack Uruguay under a different one of these agreements. They came to the US and said they're a US firm to try and get investors to into TPP. Basically, the outcomes of these cases have been very troubling. The fact that this would be in an agreement with the US and the EU is just outrageous, but we have confirmed that is the case. It's supposed to be a system to go to if you're investing in a developing country that doesn't have a reliable court system. That's the ostensible argument for why this would ever be allowed. You need to go someplace when the government actually expropriates your factory. Among the materials we put in the back table is a post I did that I put the footnotes from the links that goes through, and this is online, it's Kluwer blog. It goes through the whole history of these cases and has hot links to all of the materials on them, and as well a link to a chart that we have of all of these cases in the US, just if it seems overwhelming. So this sort of summarizes, the key point. Why the heck is this going to be included in this agreement, particularly since the volume of these cases is already exploding? Now here's the big thing we all need to think about, because this really is on the sort of top 4 or 5 things to be worried about. This one is way up there. The US has had relatively few of these challenges. Why? Because this mechanism has been in agreements between the US and a developing country that isn't a capital exporter, i.e. there are very few Guatemalan or Uruguayan or whatever companies here. The only company with whom we have this regime of private enforcement that has a lot of cross-investment is Canada. And all of the cases where we've been challenged, are Canadian companies. So far, a bunch of cases have had ridiculous technical errors in their filing. 2 cases were thrown by the tribunals, which I pretty much think politically they realized if they ruled against the US, they were going to basically chop the head off of the goose that was laying the golden eggs. Australia has now come out against investor state. They will not allow to be bound to it. That's because of these recent cases against them. So I think the tribunal didn't want that to happen here. But you can see the explosion of these cases. And if the US were to commit to this kind of private enforcement with the European Union, we're going to end up as one in the kill statistics here, because there are so many cross-registered companies here. I mean, literally, if you look at other countries where there are developed country attacks, for instance, Germany, it's Germany being attacked by who? Sweden, Vattenfall. It's their getting rid of nuclear energy. Vattenfall company, a Swiss company, has a reactor. Germany's going to shut it down. That's considered, even though they're shutting down all the reactors, that is considered an indirect expropriation, and they want compensation. So when a rich country gets sued, it's always typically by the investor of another rich country. These are just some of the key NAFTA cases. This is a slide that you guys can look at if you are so inclined. It's a list summarizing the outcomes of these kind of cases just on the environment, where there's money paid, where it's been chilled, where there's been used to get an action or an inaction. It's just a summary of all the different things. But the cases have covered zoning, land use, toxics bans, labeling, reforestry, in other countries, service sector privatization. So how do we get these kinds of rules? And I think one of the key things to keep in mind also about how we intervene effectively on this process, and it's wonderful to see such a room full of people here because it can be intervened on. It's just right now, he or she who writes the rules, pays the piper, calls the tune, and right now it's been all of these corporations. There are 600 official trade advisors. They get security clearance. They're organized by sectoral groups. They can actually see the texts which have been held in confidence. TPP has been totally held in confidence. One of the things we need to do is bust out the TAFTA text. They just cannot do this in secret the way they have. The advisors really are also seen by the trade representative's office as their constituency. And I suspect unless we change the balance of power, which is to say we cause real problems politically in not being treated with the same level of seriousness, and our desires being, there's a lot of listening but not hearing problem, or hearing not listening problem. So we'll go through the sort of puppet show of, look, we're talking to you, come to our office, so thank you, nice, nice, nice. And then you get the text and it's like, this is like the same thing they were doing 10 years ago before any data, any of us were involved, in fact, I remember when that was actually written by the Chemical Manufacturers Association, because I remember it leaking. So we need to change that dynamic, and then fast track. So the process by which these agreements get approved gives us a lot of potential leverage in Congress, which is to say Congress has exclusive authority as a check and balance put into the Constitution for trade. Now, trade agreements have gotten to be used for all these other things, but Congress still has exclusive authority. Congress has had a bad habit since Nixon asked them, originally in '73, to delegate away chunks of their authority through a mechanism called fast track. Fast track, whether or not appropriate when trade agreements only covered tariffs, is totally inappropriate now. Up front, from day one, when the Congress passes fast track, they allow the executive branch to pick the countries we'll negotiate with, decide the contents, they're non-binding negotiating terms. They decide, the executive branch negotiators, sign the agreement, blocking it, before there's ever a congressional vote. When the vote happens, it's on legislation the executive branch writes. This is the only bill they really, really write. It's not like the budget where they write it, then it's recycled. There are no markups. The bill goes directly to the floor with no committee markups. So they write the bill, their bill goes to the floor, and a vote is required in the House 45 days afterwards, yes or no vote, no amendments allowed, limited debate. It's privilege about everything but a war act. And in the Senate, same thing, no cloture, no normal procedures, no markups, legislative luge run. So basically at the very front of giving away that authority, the Congress is basically giving away its leverage. So one of our leverage points is to make sure Congress doesn't give away its authority unless and until we are satisfied that this agreement is heading in the right direction and that Congress is giving authority through a process that maintains accountability throughout the process to make sure that it stays on a track that is agreeable for the majority. I want to just flip back, actually, if I can figure out how to do that. Let me go backwards. You do it. It's okay. Oops, that's good. We'll wait for it. Now let's see if I can click again. Now I'm clicking and I'm not. Okay, great. I just want to focus on this particular point. It's obvious, but I just want to say it, that it's a whole system that really is designed just to facilitate commerce. It's not only not balanced, which would be a step in the right direction, like all government balancing of different people's interests, but in fact, it actively is saying constraints on the policy space needed to think about broader human needs of access to services and medicine, strong environmental consumer protections. So I'm going to just touch on several of the specific instruments of regulatory rollback. There are really kind of 4 main flavors of how this works. Number one is what I've been discussing a lot of, which is the investor privileges that allow attacks if the regulatory environment is changed and the outcome doesn't conform with the investor's expectations. So the investment privileges and their private enforcement is rollback power tool number one. Number two is sector-specific rules to which existing and future domestic policies have to conform. And if you don't, then you get challenged in one of these government-to-government tribunals, and you basically have trade sanctions on you like the sword of Damocles until you change your law. So I brought examples of a couple of those with news releases for Public Citizen. Public Citizen condemns WTO attack on U.S. dolphin labeling, dolphin-safe tuna labeling protections. There's one on the cigarette, the sweet-flavored cigarette case. So these are cases where the U.S. did not conform its law in the case of tuna dolphin policies, says the WTO, or in the case of the cigarette policy, heaven forbid, created a new health policy. And either one of those, another WTO country has said, those do not meet the constraints on what you're allowed to do and all those non-tariff rules in this agreement. So we're going to take your law and you to a tribunal, and when the tribunal says it's a violation, then you either have to get rid of it or you're going to face trade sanctions. So we're coming up to the you have to get rid of it date for the meat issue in April and the cigarettes and the dolphins in July. And at least on meat, the administration's actually come up with a very clever way to deal with it that's going to cause, I think, a continuing dispute that we can now use for educational purposes over time. But for the moment, it's not rolling back the law, which is the first time ever. Every other one of these rulings, the U.S. is conformed by gutting the law. So it's a very...
What's the substance on this one?
Say again?
What's the substance on this one?
This is country of origin meat labeling. And this is actually a good...
Tony will talk about that more.
Yeah, he's going to talk. And it's a good indication, by the way, that on some level, on some of these issues, if we frame them correctly, and we make it about things, what you all work on every day, that affects everyone's day-to-day lives, the whole point of your coalition in translating, regulation into, hello, it saves your mother, that frame actually is, as this cool thing, is proven an unusual opportunity actually to politically be able to push back. Another thing is obligations to actively, affirmatively eliminate regulatory differences. This is yet another obligation separate from the first two. This generally three flavors: harmonization, equivalence, and mutual recognition. I will explain each of those. And in addition, for those who really want to get into this, I brought a copy of a law review article that I did with the University of Kansas Law Review about this very theme that provides a footnoted tour through all of these concepts, each of these different sort of instrumentalities, plus a bunch of the international agencies that I referred to, which I'm going to get to in a second, that are part of this system. Regulatory convergence I already described. That's beyond standards being made the same. It's also this idea of everyone needs their own OIRA. and its cost-benefit analysis perspective. And then notification, I don't go into detail, but for some sectors this is important. Notification is where the government has a new obligation to list in advance for the other country's trade agency any domestic policy that could be non-conforming that is upcoming or that is existent. It's like sending them the target list. And it's saying them, here's some things you might want to step on before they actually get hatched. And if this seems, this is not actually in our existing agreements. For instance, in WTO, you have to, once you've actually issued a regulation, you do have to let the other countries know, but you don't have to give advance notice. The Trade Representative's Office had started to give advance notice because, they are just so conscientious with their work. And all of a sudden, a bunch of states, during the period where there was a big push to ban BPH in chewy toys, they were getting all of these calls. And they're like, how the hell does China know that, Kansas is trying to, and it turned out that USTR was giving this advance notice. So this is actually a real thing, because then it became a démarche, right before a challenge attack on the standard, and then the U.S. has to respond, and then invariably the federal government comes and pounds on the state, and bad. So I'm going to go through each of these a little bit, really superficial though, if you want to get into it more, grab the law review article, there are copies back there. So examples of the notion of having to conform your domestic laws. The most important thing here, if nothing else sticks with you, is it's not just equal treatment. It's actually conforming your laws to specific substantive, subjective standards. So with patents, you have to have a 20-year patent. So when we joined WTO, we had to change from a 17-year patent for drugs to a 20-year patent. You have to do that. If you do not do that, you get challenged. Or, for instance, certain forms of service sector regulation simply are not allowed. Bans, there are flat bans on access, zero quota. Things that limit, that have needs testing as a condition for access, size limits. And heads up, because this is in this agreement, we've already been warned, the European Union is pushing for new disciplines on these non-market access forms of regulation, such as professional licensing, technical standards, and they want to push a necessity test on top of all the other tests, which, if we have time to discuss it, is a very bad thing in WTO jurisprudence. It basically makes you bear the burden of proving the negative, that there wasn't some less trade restrictive way to do the thing that may be the only technically, politically, economically feasible way you did it. Another example of this is the food standards. So under our existing agreements, only food and product standards conforming to international standards, or those that are less trade restrictive, i.e. weaker than the international standards, are presumed not to be a trade barrier. So if you go higher, then you have to meet a whole series of tests that involve sound science, risk assessment. The way it plays out, basically, is there's a ceiling but no floor, which is to say, if you're weaker, no problem. If you're higher, and as a result something can't get in, that's the thing that gets smushed down. And as a result of the science rule, there's no precautionary principle-based regulation allowed. So I threw up here, and again, we're not going to stop on these, some slides. Here's the WTO Agreement, Trade and Services. You know, it's basically the measures which a member shall not maintain old policies or adopt new ones, unless you have an exception, unless otherwise scheduled, include limits on the number. So zero number, i.e. you're banning something, limits on the total value, limits on the total number of quantity of service express, output express, that's like firewalls. Measures which restrict or require specific types of legal entities, so making something non-profit. Elder care must be non-profit. Or having a requirement that certain financial services functions can only happen through a certain kind of form. This is the WTO Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, same thing. Members shall base their standards on international standards. Only the ones that actually meet this will be deemed to conform. And here are the limited reasons why you can go higher, but only if you use the procedures that we lay out as risk assessment and etc. So obligations to eliminate regulatory difference. Harmonization is everyone coming to one standard, which then gets adopted as the domestic standard. Harmonization. Lovely word, very bad when applied to the regulatory sphere. So in these trade agreements, either committees are set up, and in NAFTA and WTO, there are a lot of these committees. None of us are keeping, well, I should speak for myself. I hope you guys are, because I myself am not keeping sufficient track of them, because there are too many of them, and industry is all over them, and they meet in really impossible places to get to when they allow you in, which is not the time, because it's largely just negotiations between government officials. It's not sort of done with notice and comment rulemaking. They sit in an international NAFTA Transportation Standards Harmonization Committee. That's one they actually did track. And they basically sit down and figure out what they're going to do to rewrite NHTSA rules, which is funny because we kind of think that would be done on the record using notice and comment rulemaking. They typically, once they have a new harmonized rule, they do give notice of that to adopt it, but post facto. There are also some agreements, none of the current US ones, but a lot of them in Asia, where they simply identified this is an international standard set by this body or that body. We're all going to adopt that as our domestic law, and that's what we're going to trade on. Equivalence, you get to keep your existing standard in your own country, but you have to determine that the other country's regulatory approach is equivalent, delivers an equivalent, is equivalent so that it delivers the same level of protection you wanted. Now this is the infamous question that I think maybe Tony you first asked many years ago, how is something different? Basically, I've used it ever since, and I probably haven't given you sufficient copyright, but, and Tony's going to give an example in the meat area that will basically make everyone a vegan, but the equivalent requirement basically is that you say the entire regulatory system of your country is the same as the US. And like, let's just say your meat inspection for an entire country like Mexico, and it doesn't have plant inspection, you rely on their enforcement. Mutual recognition is similar to equivalence, except it's usually recognition of each other's conformity assessment. which is you allow the different agencies that determine if you're meeting the standards to make the determination on behalf of your agency. So instead of FDA having to say, yeah, that meets US standards, then the other country's agency does it. That's just the agreement on sanitary and sanitary standards of food standards and equivalence. You know, you shall accept the measures of the other party as equivalent, even if different from their own, if they can show you that it's the same measure, level of protection that you're trying to get. Let's see if this will go forward. Now, there's a lot of reference to international standards. It's very important to understand the international standard setting bodies that are typically identified in these agreements are frequently those that do not allow public interest input, or if they do, the Codex Alimentarius now has been pried open. It's impossible to actually participate because there's so many subcommittees, et cetera, where the food industry is all over, and there are 6 of us versus 700 of them. There are several of them, the Codex Alimentarius for Food and the ISO, International Standardization Organization, that for non-food standards are listed in a lot of past trade agreements. I assume in TAFTA they're going to be written in, as will probably some of the old rules, by reference. The big problems with this are totally private sector standards end up being accepted as if, in these agreements, they become public law. So things we had no role in trying to put together end up becoming the international standard on which you have to base your law, or you're in violation of the trade agreement, the text of which becomes US law. I have a citation up there to this study, which lists all of those bodies and covers all of their different scope of the ones we know, because they pop up like mushrooms after a rain. Because basically, if they could be open to government oversight, is the standard in WTO. If a government person could be surveying what's going on, then the standard becomes a deemed international standard for the trade agreements. My personal favorite one here is chic, which is the cosmetic industry's group. I have maybe one more slide or two. So if the elements of this big mess already exist, then what the hell's the difference with these negotiations? I've just painted pretty much a horror show using the old history, and it is a damn horror show. What's different? Number one, those agreements, as scary as they are, ain't half as bad as what's being cooked up for the TPP, or for that matter, what we agreed to with Korea. I mean, the WTO and the NAFTA era were blood-curdling compared to any past agreement. Trade agreements used to be about trade. Now, the agreements that we would get at this moment with the US and the EU is going to be based on what they call the 21st century standard. And that is much more damage than we currently have imposed on us through the WTO with respect to the EU. Not the least of which is, right now we have a lot of stuff that's not covered in service sector regulation, in government procurement policy. We can have green conditions. A lot of space that we still have that this is about getting rid of. Also, some of the later agreements have mandatory harmonization. So NAFTA set up committees to talk about doing these things, but they didn't have a date. Some of the later agreements have dates, and a lot of the agreements that the European Union has, like with the Caribbean, have dates. By X date, we will have a common standard on pesticides or whatever. Very troubling additional things we're getting into. As well, because there's so much investment between the US and the EU, having those investor rules and the private enforcement is a serious damn problem that does not exist. Right now, the US and the EU companies cannot do that to each other. They do not have the new extra rights or the access to the tribunals to sue each other. Number three, and I would say this is more my trying to get into the head of your coalition, is just the philosophy under it, which is this is just basically a fiesta of the antithesis of your whole point, which is, regulation, safeguards are not an inefficiency that has to be gotten away with. Entire calculation of this agreement's benefit you see kicked around trillions of dollars, billions of dollars, it's in getting rid of inefficient regulation. That's the whole frame. So all the good work you guys have done to reframe that argument about what a regulation really means for people's lives is basically, in this debate, is just going to be danced all over with, spike-heeled boots. And in addition, it just crashes any notion that there should be consumer preferences, that a democratic governance system is going to get different decisions from different people. And that's actually a value that we cherish. That is not something that needs to be gotten rid of. And it's not just the EU's residents who stand to lose. Number one, in those areas where we're stronger, there is space for plenty of downward pressure here. And more importantly, for undermining our policymaking procedures, which in many ways still remain more open and inclusive than those in the EU. We have huge potential preemption internationally of state-level policy space, so we have fought successfully to fight to keep sort of the laboratories of the states.
Is that going to include common law? Essentially rules mandated by the common law as opposed to just state regulatory rules?
Any government action can be sued as an investor violation, so common law.
So any duty to warn about chemical hazards in the environment?
We should walk through your specific scenario, and I can tell you where it would pop up. You could certainly have an investor who could claim that you doing something to them for failing to do that is a violation of their investor rights, is how that would play out. And also, we would close policy space in the areas we need to improve. In 1990, when I came to Washington, first working for Public Citizen, I worked on trying to update our chemical safety standards. Hello? So then finally, the investor-state enforcement is just a big honking deal. And what can be done? And this is for part 2, and we'll discuss it, but demand transparency. We need to get down the terms of reference in negotiations. There are different formal comments. I suggest you do it, if nothing else, so you can go back and say you did it. It will or will not be of much effect. I'm sadly to say not often of much to the actual USTR. But when you go to the regulators from the other agencies, which is one of the things to be done, coordinating internationally, both to monitor what the hell's going on until we get it opened up and to advocate. Congressional counter-pressure, Senate hearings, sign-on letters, especially those who supported the agreements in the past, and then making sure there's no trade authority until we have more control of the situation. Another piece, of course, is to go to the regulatory agencies that may be friends and make sure they know what's going on so that they're at the table, which happens in a lot of other countries, but here it's all USTR all the time. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Tony Cobra from Food and Water Watch, and I wanted to acknowledge a couple of former colleagues. Barbara Sopel, who was here from ASME. I actually set foot in this building 37 years ago, dating myself. And Barbara had just come on board to work in our political action department. But I came here to work as a labor economist, and I also worked on, as an issue, combating the privatization of public services. And I've never stopped that mission. And I also want to recognize Lori. And I used to work at Public Citizen, and Lori was a great mentor. Her staff, Mary Batari at the time, wrote probably the seminal piece on equivalency in the WTO Comes to Dinner, and I helped Mary out with that research project. But it's still used up on Capitol Hill as the Bible on equivalency. With all of it, and I've worked on food safety now going on 13 years, and primarily I've been working in the area of meat and poultry inspection. And the various trade agreements that have been negotiated have had alarming trends in deregulation of food inspection that could find a lot of these concepts are probably going to find themselves in these TAFTA negotiations. The meat and poultry industries are the most heavily regulated for food safety in this country. It requires that government-paid inspectors provide continuous inspection of domestic and it also applies for imported products. The countries that export to this country have to provide government-paid inspectors, and they have to provide continuous inspection. As you probably saw a couple of weekends ago in the Washington Post, USDA was, the Food Safety Inspection Service was one of the agencies, one of the few agencies that escaped the sequester cuts because of the fact that the industry, and a number of us just sat back and let the industry do all the work, realized that unless FSIS got its money restored, the plants, the meat and poultry plants could not operate. By law, in slaughter facilities, you have to provide carcass-by-carcass inspection. Companies cannot open up their doors unless there's an FSIS inspector present. And in processing facilities where you turn the slaughtered product into sausage or hamburger, there has to be inspection on every shift of production. So the industry realized that if they weren't going to have inspectors on the job, and they were all going to be furloughed, they could not open up the doors. So they went to Congress and got money shifted around, so they got to keep the inspectors on the job, and the plants are going to continue to operate. Up until 1995, USDA had a standard for imported products that all of the inspection had to be equal to our standard. So in essence, it had to be pretty much identical. But as a result of the creation of the World Trade Organization, this new concept got introduced called equivalency. And as Lori explained, essentially that says that you can have alternate inspection systems provided that you provide the same level of protection as your domestic food safety system. And so as a result, both the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act were amended to introduce this concept. Some of the countries that were already exporting to the United States were mysteriously grandfathered in to this new system. There was no explanation provided, but they were our major trading partners, so they got put in. Other countries had to follow a new procedure that FSIS had established, and that is essentially rulemaking. The process is fairly transparent in the beginning. A country that initially wants to apply for equivalence of determination has to go through a review process. The FSIS then proposes a rule. The public has the opportunity to comment on the rule, and if they're still satisfied, if the agency is still satisfied that the country can meet our standards, then they are put in the Code of Federal Register, the Code of Federal Regulations, either as a red meat exporter or as a poultry exporter. But there's one aspect of this, that once you're in the club, and there are 34 countries now that are in the club, either they can export poultry and or meat, any further tinkering with their inspection system goes through an equivalence determination process that is behind closed doors. So if a country wants to change their inspection procedures, they want to change their laboratory procedures, and they apply to FSIS for those changes, FSIS does this behind closed doors. And as a result of some screaming a few years ago, they are starting to publish those determinations on their website, but they're fait accompli. You don't have, unless you catch wind of it, and some of us have the reason some of us catch wind of some of these changes is some of the inspector unions will contact us saying, look, Australia wants to change the inspection system. Can you weigh in with USDA? So we're able to try to change those systems before they're finalized. But for the most part, those changes are done, and they just post them up on their website. Of the 34 countries that are currently deemed to be equivalent to the United States, 23 of them are European countries. The amount of meat that we're actually getting from these European countries, especially beef, is still relatively low. It's primarily because of the mad cow outbreak in the 80s and 90s. But since the late 1990s, the so-called quadrilateral countries, the Quads, U.S., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, have been plotting to deregulate the inspection process for meat and poultry products. In 1998, USDA began pilot projects in certain poultry facilities and hog slaughter facilities that have removed government inspectors from the slaughter lines and replaced them with company-paid inspectors. And the reason for this change was USDA's contention that so-called quality defects should be handled by the companies and not government inspectors, who should focus on food safety issues. Some of those quality defects that they defined include visible fecal contamination, by very nature, are raise food safety issues because that's where the foodborne pathogens are found. In 2000, USDA recognized a privatized inspection model for meat imports from Australia. And because of the controversy that recognition caused both here and in Australia, no Australian meat company decided to adopt a new inspection system. In 2006, USDA secretly recognized a privatized inspection model in Canada for beef exports to the United States. And they used as a basis to grant that equivalency determination the hog slaughter pilot that was being used here. So we have a different species of animal. The meat is coming from cattle rather than hogs, but the United States decided to grant Canada the ability to export meat to the United States, even though no beef company was using a privatized system here in the United States as the basis for Canada to export their beef products to the United States under a privatized system. In 2007, shortly after the United States ratified the U.S.-Australian Free Trade Agreement, we recognized a pilot in Australia for a privatized inspection model for red meat exports to the United States. In 2011, USDA permitted New Zealand to pilot a privatized inspection model for mutton exports to the U.S. In late 2011, USDA approved the privatized inspection model for Australian red meat exports. And in late 2011, USDA also approved the inspection model, the privatized inspection model for mutton exports from New Zealand to the U.S. Lo and behold, what happens in the fall of 2012? Canada experienced the largest meat recall in its history, involving a plant that was using the privatized inspection model for beef slaughter. We don't know exactly how much meat was recalled in Canada, but they expanded the recall 22 times between late August and early October. But we did find out that thanks to the border inspection system that we have along the Canadian border, it was our USDA inspectors who first detected the contamination, but we also wound up importing 2.5 million pounds of that beef from that plant that also was subject to the recall. What USDA did, that instead of calling it a recall here domestically, they called it a public health alert. And through a FOIA process, I had to find out that actually, because some of the meat that came in from Canada, the 2.5 million pounds got mixed up with some domestic product, over 4.5 million pounds had to be sent back to Canada, but that's not publicly available. So that information has never gone out. The other thing that's happened is that the number of import rejections from both Australia and New Zealand using their privatized inspection models have reached record levels. We wound up getting an industry memo a beef industry memo in Australia that revealed that USDA said that Australia had become the worst exporter of meat in terms of visible fecal contamination of meat that is arriving at our ports of entry. And so we've actually had to reject millions and millions of pounds of Australian meat products, and the same situation has also been found with the New Zealand meat imports. Now, the European Food Safety Agency has recently proposed that red meat inspection in Europe be reformed to use the Australian and New Zealand models, which, by the way, the European Food Safety Agency has also recognized those privatized systems for meat exports from Australia and New Zealand to the European Union. The European Food Safety Agency has also recently approved the use of lactic acid as an antimicrobial in beef slaughter. This, as Laurie pointed out, they've had problems with chlorine in our poultry. They banned that, but you're starting to see a movement toward the use of antimicrobials in their food production. This can lead to further automation of beef production in the United States, similar to the model that we have here in the U.S. These two developments, between the fact that they want to use the privatized inspection model and the use of antimicrobials, has caused a coalition of inspector unions to contact us to supply them with information on how they can combat these new trends. And what USDA has been doing is as they've been recognizing these privatized inspection models abroad, is a way then to backdoor that here to the United States. We already have, there are a number of us here in this room who've been working on trying to fight the privatized poultry inspection model that the Obama administration proposed last year. I would not be surprised if Wednesday, when he releases his budget, besides all of the changes he wants to do to Medicare and Social Security, that he's also going to finalize that process in his budget proposal. But this is a way for, as we're recognizing these privatized inspection models abroad, to put pressure on us here to quote unquote reform our inspection system. The Obama administration has also cut the funding for the surveillance of imported meat and poultry products coming to the United States. During the Bush administration, we were spending between $18 and $20 million a year for the International Affairs Program at USDA. It is now at less than $15 million. The Canadians are trying to propose the elimination of our border inspection system for meat imports from the United States. So far, we've been able to stop it, thanks in large measure to that massive recall that happened in the fall. But there is this alarming trend of trying to deregulate the international inspection. Other areas of concern. Ed mentioned the Food Safety Modernization Act. There were a number of us who worked very hard to get it passed, but there was one provision that really stuck in our craw. It permits the recognition of private third-party auditors to certify the safety of imported meat. We were successful in not having that concept applied to domestic inspection, but there is the provision in the law, Section 307, that does permit the United States to recognize private third-party audit systems for food imports into the United States. So that is something that we're monitoring very closely. That proposed rule is sitting at OMB, and we're probably going to, our organization at least is probably going to be in opposition to setting up that system. The other thing is, we have all of these wonderful terms in terms of harmonization, equivalence. Well, FDA's come up with a new one. It's called comparability. I call it equivalence light. It's again it's not very transparent. FDA has already negotiated a comparability agreement with New Zealand. while they posted the final report on their website, there's no way that you can weigh in on the determination that they've made that New Zealand is equivalent to us. They're about to start they have started the process with Canada, and they are talking about doing a similar comparability assessment with the European Union.
Can you give us a sense of the timetable that we're dealing with for a lot of these things, since Tony was talking about stuff that's already underway and things that are already happening in some of the food safety?
I mean, June 8th, because of this tradition of the 90-day notice, which is a legacy of the old fast-track system, is the date on which they can have their first formal round of negotiation. Typically how this works is they have rounds. They typically will be a week to 2 weeks long. They'll get together in one country, in one side of the Atlantic or the other, and then they will have a bunch of chapters. There will be people assigned each chapter. They'll sit around a table, and they will each come initially with a first offer. So that cannot happen until June 8th. But what can happen between now and then is, number one, coming up with the terms of reference, i.e., what is that food standards chapter even going to look like? Is it going to have a whole bunch of new harmonization committees? Is it going to have new obligations to harmonize? Is it going to be just reiterating them both in the old agreements? There are all kinds of flavors of that. And then the second thing is, what's the U.S. first offer going to be? So each country comes with a text, and they put it on the table. That's how trade negotiation starts. So if they, let's just say they really get their act together, and on June 8th they're starting 2 weeks of negotiations, then for every one of those chapters we have to find, we have to figure out what is the U.S. going to say is their opening position. This is the text we want, and then the EU puts down the same thing. Do they start with something that's dreadful? And probably the most important thing from step one is just to have it transparent, to actually have this done in a way that those who are going to live with the results know what the hell's going on. They say they'll be done in 2 years.
So just to understand the parameters, how many chapters you said that?
Well, it's funny. It's so secret they haven't told us. And in fact, we only know there are 29 chapters in TPP because we did sort of a reverse engineering of figuring out the names of all the chapters that we know are being negotiated by walking by rooms after the negotiations are over, and then we wrote them all down and then we counted them up. Because when we asked how many chapters, we were told that's actually classified information.
We also had a question about, our counterparts in Europe. What is the kind of European consumer and union pushback been on this?
Mr. TACD? Oh, Mr. T is the chair. Geez, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so, by the way, so Rob is testifying on behalf of TACD, and Public Citizen Global Trade Watch also has, one of Lori's colleagues will also testify in our 35 minutes of the public as 10 and 5. I think we get 15 between us. But I think the pushback, as I said earlier, has been pretty aggressive. Again, in my answer to Catherine's question, I think the consumer groups have been very active, and the letter that we just sent up is about the strongest letter that I can recall TACD doing in the 14 years of its existence. What I'm concerned with is, originally the European Commission helped us set up the TACD, but they're the ones who I think are going to be weaker, much weaker, because their economies are kind of down, as you might notice, and everybody wants this thing to go forward, and their people have been given their marching orders, and it's being led by their version of the Department of Commerce over there. So it's the consumer groups are good. I don't know about the environmental and other civil society groups. Lori may know more.
Are there any business interests that lose if this stuff goes through?
Sure.
Yeah.
But it's going to be on an industry by industry basis.
Yeah, but is there a particular, is it small business versus large business? Is it some corporations that are good citizens now? How do we figure out who the winners and the losers are?
There's the way these agreements are generally put together, there's some losers we can predict. So generally the generics industry for meds is a loser. The way the U.S. has been pushing things, it's the internet carriers get clobbered in favor of the content people. So for instance, in TPP, actually, some of the big internet carriers have been kind of useful pushing back against the Disneys, etc. There are going to be specific sectors that have branded themselves for a particular niche that can get clobbered. So, for instance, depending on how this plays out, but things like organic standards. Are they going to get harmonized downward? What niche have you created based on a particular standard? People, companies that do standards that are certified sweat-free or, you know, old-growth forest, blah, 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 all these, those are the kinds of, they're called delegated authority, private sector rules that may or may not be considered something that needs to be negotiated out as a discrimination. So I think there are also niche companies. I don't know, Rob, do you have other ones you can think of? I mean, the unfortunate problem is most of the big, powerful companies, certainly the big multinationals and their associations, are extremely excited about using this as a tool to accomplish a lot of what they can't really do in the sunlight of public discussion. And that's also why they like to keep this very secret. Several times I've actually been able to brief Tea Party people, and I'm watching their faces. An interesting line that people react to is that those investor tribunals are a threat to both our sovereignty and our solvency. Because those foreign tribunals are able to order government payment of unlimited damages, basically reverse expropriating our tax dollars into private pockets. Now, all the big corporations are thinking, how do I get some of that? But the actual Tea Party base is basically just thinking, you know, that's exactly the kind of stuff that makes me crazy with government. So the rules, in this case, are something we can all agree on. That is not something government should be doing. And so having government not sign up to do that is something that we would have in common. But I mean, some countries like Argentina and Ecuador have right now just like horrifying amounts of these orders against them. And given the amount of US-EU cross-investments, you know, you can imagine the damages are based on what your expected lost future profits are in perpetuity. So like the Occidental case, you know, how the hell did they get $3 billion? It's because, you know, Occidental broke the terms of one of their oil and gas exploration permits. They got chucked out as their contract said they would if they did what they did, which they knew in advance, and they did it anyway. And then the tribunal is basically giving them money for everything they would have earned had they been able to continue, and that thing had made the money that they thought it would make. And that's the $3 billion out of Ecuador. I mean, that's the health budget for the country for 9 months. So if it were US and EU firms, and you think of the size of the throughput of some of those big firms, and then we're in the future going to be hit for everything Deutsche Bank couldn't do because of the Volcker rule or whatever in perpetuity, the damages could really start to...
And there is no appeal, right?
There is no outside appeal. It was up on the slide, but I didn't say it. There is no outside appeal. You can try and get the case annulled for certain kinds of very specific arbitral error, though, as one of my slides pointed out, even when there was a direct conflict of interest, when Vivendi tried to go after, well, went successfully after Argentina over a failed water privatization that they reversed, the actual one of the panelists was on the board of the bank that was the main investor in Vivendi. She was the judge. And that came up in an annulment, and it wasn't given, it wasn't annulled. And then you have no further appeal.
Are there any
And just maybe one way to think about that is, before you got here, ever showing these slides of the big regulatory successes all following from crisis. So those are all, there, the good story for us is, right, something terrible happens, we're actually able to just make unexpected win, something good that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to have won. Well, all those things, basically, because they were unexpected, fall into this zone of damaging the reasonable expectation of future profits. So there's kind of a pretty good correlation between when we're able to do a breakthrough positive regulatory reform, which is where it's going to run up against the limitations of the investor state system. I just want to make another comment about the transparency thing. In CSS, we've been so focused on transparency. I think it's fair to say that the transparency problems in the trade context are a couple of orders of magnitude worse than everything we face in the traditional regulatory area. In some ways, it's a horrible problem for us politically, but it should underscore how important it is for us substantively. Because like once these things get done, and then you get, instead of having it done in whatever, EPA issues a rule and it goes up to OIRA, we got to sort of figure out what the heck's going on in this black box of OIRA. Now it's not being done there, it's basically being done in some international agency like as Lori was describing that is either open or not open, but it's basically effectively the same thing because it's not practical for any of us to spend our time hanging out in these meetings, and then it comes back and you're pretty sure it's stuck. So we just can't get ourselves in that situation, because we're going to lose. Once that happens, it's done. We're going to lose automatic. And that's one piece of it, but it goes all the way through the process, starting from the beginning, which is why I think we already got number one, in the negotiations. And I don't know if everybody grasped this, but the thing that's being negotiated, why is it we don't know the number of chapters, we don't know what's in there, is that the text itself is not made public. That what they're negotiating is not made public. And if you try to FOIA it, they will say no. U.S. Chart will say no. It's got a national security exemption from FOIA, which national security you can't possibly win because the government gets to define what national security is. And it's worth, so, but compounding that, so that, like, who is the text being kept secret from when it's going on? So there's these 600 corporate advisors who are seeing it. So basically, all corporations who care get to see it, because all those guys are telling their friends. Public interest people are definitely not telling their friends because they're going to violate their confidentiality terms if they tell any of us. But anyway, all the corporations know about it. The enemy, the negotiating partner, they know by definition, because you're giving it back and forth. It's like, who in the world is being kept from? And the universe is like the public. That's it. Now that one is a really serious problem, but it's politically good for us because people get that's insane.